Hello, my name is Kate. I am a wedding and portrait photographer, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I control my settings in manual. It can be very daunting for some people to go from a automatic type settings on their camera, whatever camera it is. Yes, your auto settings are decent, but if you want to be a professional photographer, you need to master your manual mode. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I do, my thought process into how I get the right settings to capture that perfect picture. First and foremost, whichever camera you have, there's always different settings to be able to put it onto manual mode, but just typically on that top dial, you can just roll that around to the M and that will give you complete control. You then have complete control of your ISO, your shutter speed, and your f-stop. So your ISO is how sensitive your camera will be to light. The higher the f-stop though, the more grainy your picture is. If you're in bright sunshine, you're going to want your ISO down at about 100. If you are in dark evening, it can get up to 10,000, whatever it might be, depending on where you're photographing. You've then also got your shutter speed. You want a fast moving subject and you want them crisp and still, you're going to have your shutter speed really high because that will just freeze your moments. But if you are on a tripod, you can have that down at 1/15 of a second. If you want a little bit of motion in your images, then you can also keep that a little bit slower of a shutter speed because that gives a little bit more interest. Typically, if I'm handheld, I will keep my shutter speed at around 400 shots per second, and that will give me enough with confidence that I'm going to be able to freeze that frame. I often will have my subjects moving, so I know that I'm going to keep that a little bit more crisp. And your aperture, that determines how much light is going to be allowed onto your sensor. Your aperture also is going to control your bokeh, which is your blurry background that a lot of people will go for. Depends on your lens and your distance from you to your subject and the subject to the foreground, but background to your background. So all these things can all factor in to get that one right shot, but you've got to be familiar with your settings to be able to adjust it to suit your situation, because lighting can also play a very big role in this. I'm going to tell you a little bit my thought process is when I'm trying to choose my right settings. First thing I always like to set is my shutter speed. The reason I do that is because if you have all your other settings correct and your shutter speed to be able to get the most accurate lighting for your camera, for your settings, is to have your shutter speed too slow, then it's not going to matter. Your photo is going to be anyway. You're going to delete it because it's going to be blurry and you may have wanted it crisp, and vice versa. If your shutter speed's too high, you need to be able to have your other settings high enough that you're allowing enough light in to be able to capture it so it's not underexposed. I know, there's a process. First thing I love to do is set my shutter speed. Like I said, if I'm handheld, I've got a little bit of movement going on, I'll keep it about 1/400th of a second. That I can know things are going to be a little bit crisp. If I'm going to have a lot more movement, say I'm going to have someone piggybacking or I'm going to have them running through the field, whatever it might be, I'm going to bump that up to 1/600, somewhere in there. I'll play with it, right? You have to always analyze what you're capturing to make sure it's not blurry and that it's in focus and all that kind of thing. So those are my kind of sweet spots. From there, I'll adjust my aperture. My aperture, I love having it about as wide open as I can within reasons. Most of my lenses are 1.2s, so that will if I got closer up to somebody's faces, then maybe their lips are the only thing that's going to be in focus and everything else will be out of focus. Well, if I've got a couple and their faces are super close together like this, I want maybe their whole face in focus and a little bit further back. So I'm going to maybe bump that down to 1.4, 1.8. So I use 1.2 sparingly, but I do like the 1.4. That's kind of my go-to spot. Unless I'm photographing, say, a family of 4 or 5, then I'm going to put that up to f4. So there's all these tricks. You set your shutter speed, you're then going to choose your f-stop, and that's going to allow that extra bokeh. Having that at 1.4, so I love the bokeh, and I love having nice crisp shots. The slow shutter speed is sort of a newer trend, but I'm not quite on it yet. Maybe I just haven't mastered it yet, so maybe I need to practice more. Shutter speed, aperture, and then based on how your photograph is exposing, you can then adjust your ISO to suit the settings that you have to allow enough light into your camera. So your ISO, like I said, if it's bright daylight and you've got a wide open aperture, you're allowing a lot of light into that sensor, you're going to want that ISO right down. But if you're photographing it later at night, you can keep those settings where they are and you can bump your ISO up, whatever works for you. So it's going to be sort of this give and take. I like to keep my aperture, like I said, around 1.4. That's my sweet spot. That's what works for me. That's what gets me the look that I like, that my clients are coming to me for. And then I'll adjust my ISO and my shutter speed to suit. If you're on a bright sunny day and you've got your aperture at 1.4 and you've got your ISO at 100 and it's still too bright, then I'll bump my shutter speed up. not necessarily to as high as it needs to go, because sometimes I'll need to bump my f-stop up. Just it's like this constant moving track, if you will. So as one thing moves, the other thing might have to move. But if that has to move too much, then your other two settings have to kind of sway with it. So yeah, it's finding this balance between the two. But that's always the process that I go. So I'll shutter speed, aperture, what's the other one? ISO. With these settings in mind, there's a couple things that I want you to really pay attention to, and that's not to underexpose too much. You don't want to, especially if you're photographing in the evening and you're backlighting. I love backlighting, especially with that sun setting, but if you underexpose too much, you're going to affect your skin tones. So you need to find this balance of like underexpose so you're not blowing out your highlights, because as soon as you overexpose your lights, your whites, you can't ever retrieve them. So I love underexposing a little bit, and then you can bring them up in post. And again, you really don't want to lose those highlights, especially if you're photographing bright daylight, because depending on what your subject is, you may not have a choice in the time of day. Weddings are always in the middle of the day, peak afternoon, the worst light possible, and 90% of the time they don't choose their location based on lighting, because they don't know. They have no idea what's actually going to photograph terribly and not get necessarily the look that they are envisioning for their ceremony, because they just simply don't know. So when it comes to weddings, I'll talk all about that another time. It's just helping and educate your clients. Let's just wrap this up. I always set my shutter speed first. I set my aperture pretty much on par wherever it is. I will adjust it if I need to, just to suit what light works with the other two settings they have for shutter speed and ISO. And then my ISO is normally kind of my last one, but you can take it gauged on, you know, the time of the day. So it's going to be 100 ISO probably if you're in bright sunlight. If you're indoors, it might be anywhere around 400. And then you're going to go, as soon as you go into your evenings are going to get more towards your, I've once shot in really high ISO, but it gets grainy as shit. So not necessarily where you want to be. You might want to bring in flash at that point. So that's a whole other thing. These are the first 3 settings that you need to master 100% if you want to be a professional photographer. One thing that I didn't realize at the very beginning was controlling my white balance. So that's something you might want to start playing with once you've mastered these other ones. I shot with auto white balance for a very long time because I didn't want one more thing to control, because I'm like, I already thinking about all these other things and how they can work together with the lighting, and I was just like, it's too much. Once I understood Kelvin and how to control it, I had a gauge for the same thing. You have these gauges for all of these different settings when you get familiar with them, but I had a gauge for my white balance for daytime, for my evenings, for indoors, for outdoors, whatever it might be. And it was really just a small adjustment after that, but you also have to make sure you find something that works with your settings, with your presets, your time of day. If you keep the same settings when you're backlight in the evening versus when you've got that sunset facing your client, they're going to be orange. They're going to look like Smurfs. Working with your settings, try your white balance as soon as you are feeling comfortable, and just get a gauge for it, play around with it, and I promise you it will really take your photos to the next level, opposed to letting your camera control it for you.